And welcome to our next speaker in the Department of Geography 21-22 academic year speakers series. So this is the first of two. This year we're having two. Edward Ned Tafe Endowed Colloquium Series. So this is in honor of Ned Tafe. So Ned was born in Chicago, really preeminent OSU geographer. So he was born in Chicago. He studied at the University of Chicago and was in graduate school there in the 1950s, right in the kind of the key era, talking about the Chicago urban models, and really that formed the basis for a lot of spatial geography that took place in the latter half of the 20th century. He, after being at Chicago, he worked at Northwestern for several years, and then he came to Ohio State in 1963 to become our chairman. And yes, chairman was the term of the time. So he was chairman of this department from 1963 until 1992, which is a really long period of time, serving as president of the AAG, the American Association of Geographers, from 71 to 72. Ned Tafe was a specialist in urban transportation and spatial analytical geography. He was known to be a gifted teacher, so he really emphasized both undergraduate and graduate training and the connections among that. He believed in the seminar. He believed in getting together and having discussions about the new methods and new questions in geography. And he was a big proponent of geography in the National Academies of Science. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Joel to give you a more formal introduction of our first Ned Tafe speaker of this year, Professor Becky Mansfield.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Darla, for that introduction. But as a point of order, I should say that the introduction of Becky will be given by my colleague, Max Woodworth, who was just logged in. So Max, if you can, I'll pass the mic to you.
I don't know if anyone can hear me or see me.
Yes, we can. The floor is yours, Max. We can't see you, but we can hear you loud and clear. Go right ahead.
Ah, you can hear me. Okay, good. Well, hi, everyone. I can't see you, but hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here with everyone again today, and to offer a few words of introduction for our esteemed colleague, Dr. Becky Mansfield, also known simply as Becky around here. As many of you surely know, Becky is a leading voice, I think it's fair to say, in the broad subfield of environment and society relations. And given her spot at the forefront of the field, has been really instrumental in driving debates, especially on issues of environmental governance, environmental logics, rationalities of nature, etc. So she's really been a towering figure in these areas, and it's wonderful to have her as a colleague with that kind of broad repute. I'm thinking about how to characterize her work, both for myself and maybe how to summarize it for others. I see it really as a kind of as a concern for the where and how socially derived logics intersect with unruly physical natures. Now, not being able to see Becky's reaction in her face to how I characterize that, I hope it's not summarizing it in too broad brush strokes. But what I think is fair to say is that Becky really does push the boundaries, and sorry, that's my dog barking here, on questions about social natures and environmental politics. I think for those of us who read her work and talk with her and have listened to her talks, it's very clear that she's consistently several steps ahead of the pack, really doing just incredible work, revealing dimensions of popular and scientific understandings of natural sciences that skate rather too breezily over important questions that she brings out with really intricate arguments. And also it's just wonderful, beautiful writing as well. That I think, but especially it's the concern with social questions that arise through inadequate or partial or incomplete understandings of science that I think she really does such interesting work on. And just to make that a little bit more concrete, I thought maybe I'd just mention that her work on epigenetics is one such area I could pull out as an example. It's one area of her research in recent years. I mean, in this part of Becky's work, I think she really exposes, among other things, how the frontiers of epigenetic science end up bearing all the traces of the scientists involved, including their blind spots and ignorances on gender, race, and other issues. And then also more sinisterly, how the emergent non-dualist natural sciences that the epigenetics have sort of emerged as get shaped into powerful tools of social control, very much overturning the hopeful potential of these breakthroughs in this particular area of science. And I think she does this this really wonderful work in kind of revealing the logical flaws in epigenetic science, but not just to kind of expose them, but also to point out how it might be done better and how the work might be put to more socially just uses. And I think that's really key. I could, of course, say a lot more about Becky's enormous work over the years. She has a very long CV, but I've been told to keep this short, and so I will. But I do want to keep it brief, but at the same time, I will, however, I'll just say one or two things more from a personal level about Becky as a colleague, and if I may. The first is that I think I've really, and I think this is true for a lot of people, I've always appreciated the time and effort that Becky dedicates to teaching and mentorship. Time and again, I've seen how her guidance and judgment, support made a crucial difference for keeping graduate students on course. And for me as well, her advice and support were key really at crucial moments. I'm not sure she realizes that, but they were really helpful at times when I needed it. Well, finally, Becky and I actually drove together down to Lexington, Kentucky last year for the Dimensions of Political Ecology conference, which happened to fall on I think it was the last weekend of February, which would be the last time there would be any in-person meetings before everything kind of fell apart and everyone dispersed to their homes into lockdown. So anyway, long drives are usually good chances to get to know someone. And well, there's nothing really especially noteworthy about the drive to say, except that for me, at least, it was a good chance to get to know Becky better and to talk about family, about our respective backgrounds and how we came to be at OSU. And I also learned she knows a huge amount about birds, which we were spotting on the way there and back, which maybe shouldn't surprise me, given her lifelong interest in the natural world. Anyway, it was at the DOPE conference that I heard what I presume is the beginnings of this paper that we're going to hear today. The topic then, as it is today, from what I read of the blurb, concerns the profoundly consequential social and political uses to which science gets put. Now, I hesitate to summarize it any further because I'm sure she has much more to say and it'll be much more interesting. So, but I do want to say that I think we're in for a treat. We always are with any talk that Becky gives. And I'm really looking forward to this. So without further ado, I'll pass the virtual mic to Becky and let her take it away.
Oh, thank you, Max. That was an amazingly generous introduction. I don't even remember talking about birds on the trip down, but the grad students who are in my class this semester will appreciate that because we ended up talking about birds during class. So, so thank you so much. And this is indeed a kind of continuation of the talk that I gave last year at Dimensions of Political Ecology. And from your introduction, I was like, oh, it would be more fun to be doing something on epigenetics. But I feel like in many ways, kind of being fascinated by what was happening with science and deregulatory science during the Trump administration kind of pulled me in different directions. And so that's part of what you're seeing here today. So the talk I'm giving today is deregulatory science. I assume everybody can see that now. Chemical risk analysis in Trump's EPA. And of course, when I was writing all this, it still was Trump's EPA. And so it's interesting to think about what happens now that it is not Trump's EPA. So this talk is based on a paper that has since been published in Social Studies of Science, as well as some additional information from some ongoing work on the EPA race and particulate matter, or including Trump's EPA. The spring of 2020, as we all know, marked this breathing crisis, and it was especially so for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the United States, where there was the spectacular and individualized violence for the murder of Black people by police, which sparked a renewed Black Lives Matter movement pictured here. And this was alongside the stark and anonymized violence of the coronavirus pandemic, also pictured here. The pandemic hit harder for Black and Indigenous people who contracted COVID at higher rates and with worse outcomes. And while this inequity has many causes, among them is the role of the cruddy and everyday violence of air pollution. So pollutants such as particulate matter, and that's the fine particles of dust and soot that are both direct and indirect consequences of fossil fuels and petrochemicals, cause a range of cardiovascular and neurological health effects, even at low dose exposures. And not only are people of color exposed to particulate matter at much higher rates than white people, but epidemiological research also linked particulate matter to worse COVID experience. And as Lindsay Dillon and Julie Say pointed out 5 years ago, the phrase "I can't breathe" encapsulates a broader critique of police violence, and it also resonates with an environmental justice and public health standpoint, an argument they made with specific reference to particulate matter, as their title suggests. And then just yesterday, I just kind of plunked this in, The Guardian published this article, which includes a quote from a 1968 Shell Oil internal report saying that that particulate matter, these particles, are the real villains in health effects, as they can bring toxins deep into the lungs, which would otherwise be removed in the throat. I don't know exactly the science of whether they would be otherwise removed in the throat, but the idea that in 1968 Shell Oil was saying this is important. So in the midst of this breathing crisis of 2020, then the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, went on a deregulatory spree. The Trump EPA's initial response to the coronavirus was to relax enforcement of regulations nationwide, particularly related to pollution monitoring and reporting. That's the top headline here. And simultaneously, it engaged in a blitz of deregulatory activity that both directly and indirectly related to air pollution. And that included a decision not to strengthen regulation of particulate matter. And that's the other headline here. So, and I'm going to discuss several of these measures throughout the talk. So this deregulatory spree was the culmination of the over 3 years work at that point during the Trump administration, as EPA tried to finalize things in ways that would make them harder to undo if Trump lost the election, which of course he did, and things are being undone. So I'll mention that as we go. So I followed this multi-year effort, which puts last spring's activities into perspective. So yes, during the coronavirus pandemic, EPA implemented a series of rules that failed to regulate air pollutants that exacerbate the pandemic in racially uneven ways. And even more so, the multi-year effort to deregulate these fossil fuel-driven pollutants drove wider changes at EPA in how to assess whether chemical exposures cause harm. That is, this was an effort to alter how EPA assesses hazards and exposures, costs and benefits. This is the risk analyses that in our current system are the basis for deciding whether and how to regulate specific pollutants. So this is where my main intervention comes in. How should we best understand and respond to this sort of attempt to remake regulatory science? To a large extent, critics cast the Trump administration as anti-science, requiring in response vigorous defense of science. And my analysis of the Trump EPA reveals instead a strategy to develop deregulatory science. According to its political appointees, and you see here Andrew Wheeler on the left, Scott Pruitt on the right, both Trump EPA administrators. So these political appointees said that the Trump EPA stood for scientific integrity and for developing evidence-based approaches that show regulation to be neither necessary nor appropriate. And I argue that this is an effort to engage science, to delegitimize environmental regulation. I also argue for continuity between the Trump EPA and past efforts to use science to justify regulatory rollbacks. A key lesson is that contesting deregulation by declaring it anti-science reflects an impasse, as deregulatory approaches then also seek to take the mantle of science. The alternative to engaging in debate over demarcation is to make explicit the values and interests that shape regulatory science. The real world stakes are highlighted by the contemporary breathing crisis, that is, the ways deregulatory science institutionalizes environmental racism, classism, other forms of injustice. So this first part of the talk will provide some historical perspective on science in the EPA, and the second part will delve into the Trump EPA's attempts to institutionalize deregulatory science. The final section will then return to the broader implications and arguments. So in her 1990 book on regulatory science at EPA, science studies scholar Sheila Jasanoff describes a crisis of legitimacy in the 1980s, when the agency was seen as overly captured by political interests. It inspired calls for more science to re-legitimize regulatory decision-making. Throughout the presidency of Donald Trump, there was a steady drumbeat of similar claims that the Trump administration, broadly, and especially EPA, were not just harmful, but anti-science. And a few examples from lawn signs to regulatory trackers are here on the screen. And the picture from the New York Times article on the bottom right is the EPA headquarters in DC. And in fact, again, just yesterday, lots of news. The new EPA administrator, Michael Regan, said that science is back in the Biden EPA. So, and striking during this time, during the Trump administration, was the extent to which prominent scientists who usually stay out of the political fray openly criticized Trump EPA protocols and proposals. And I'll discuss more about this secret science rule later in the talk, but note that this was the editors of Science, Nature, PLOS, Cell Press, and PNAS. So in this context, Jasanoff's 1990 account of science controversy at EPA is an excellent reminder that this is not new. Despite claims about the exceptionalism of the Trump administration, such debates about regulatory science really have some very long roots. Yet if we follow Jasanoff's account in more detail, there appears to be a striking reversal since the 1980s from industry-led deregulatory defense of science then to environmentalist-led pro-regulatory defense of science now. During the Reagan administration, deregulatory interests called for more science in the face of what they saw as politically motivated regulatory overreach. In Jasanoff's account, pro-industry interests charged that in its regulatory zeal, the young EPA exceeded both scientific evidence and its legislative mandate. And this seems quite opposite the recent situation in which pro-regulatory interests try to defend science from corporate capture and regulatory underreach with regard to a wide range of issues such as climate change and toxic pollution. The claim today is that Trump officials engaged in politically motivated efforts to ignore established science and scientific experts to evade legislative mandates. So it was in the context of these widespread fears about an anti-science agenda in the Trump administration that I started tracking the role of science in a range of EPA deregulatory actions. And I found a striking pattern across a wide range of memorandums, guidance documents, new rules, various public statements. In them, Trump EPA officials declared that their approaches are better science, more objective, transparent, less speculative, better grounded in evidence, and so forth. Now, I certainly understand the temptation to interpret these claims to scientific integrity as merely rhetorical. But my argument here is that the agency's actions were not non-science, but are a form of deregulatory science. And I make this move not to legitimize these approaches, nor to present EPA officials as earnest or reasonable. Rather, I do so to provide a better understanding of the mechanisms through which the state produces and mobilizes scientific knowledge against protective regulations. And I do so by taking a closer look at controversy and demarcation in regulatory science. Instead of a reversal from the 1980s to today, I see instead striking continuity. The 1980s pro-science stance was not actually a defense of science in the abstract, but was central to an ongoing political strategy to use science to delegitimize regulatory action. And in this light, today's stance is not anti-science so much as it's another chapter in this effort. And at the same time, then pro-regulatory calls to defend science are also part of these decades of back and forth over what counts as good science. Each effort to demarcate good science from non-science leads not to the end of controversy, but to the next round, as all sides seek to establish their approach as properly scientific and others as politically captured and hence non-scientific. That's the demarcation. So this suggests the limits to Trump era efforts to defend science. It is not despite, but because of decades of efforts to demarcate science from politics and regulatory science that the Trump EPA in turn remakes practices of risk analysis and justifies those in terms of scientific legitimacy. By situating the Trump EPA's approach not as exceptional, but as a new chapter of an ongoing history, I show that as alluring as it may be to defend regulation by dismissing the Trump EPA as anti-science, such efforts reflect an impasse. So what was really going on in those calls for more science in the 1980s? Deregulatory defense of science certainly was consistent with the kind of general 20th century ethos that links science to rationalist Eurocentric notions of civilizational progress, capitalist markets, and faith in technology. Given this, the calls for more science and expertise that Jasanoff describes were consistent with long-standing efforts to dismiss environmentalism as romantic and anti-progress, and two such books from the 1980s and 1990s are here on the screen. But as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway contend, scientific findings consistently supported the claims of environmentalists. And it was because of this, not their romanticism, that environmentalists were under attack. Science-based regulation posed a serious threat to free market industrial production, and so scientific findings needed to be questioned, not defended. Those calls for more science were part of long-standing deregulatory political strategies that had little to do with technophilic faith in science, defense of scientific values in the face of uninformed emotional opinion. Those calls for more science have much more to do with preventing regulation by producing scientific doubt about its necessity. And a rich body of scholarship in science studies has documented this production of doubt, showing that it does sometimes take the form of outright lies and suppression of evidence, as that Guardian article might suggest. But production of doubt also takes the form of demarcation. Indeed, charges of romanticism are an example of how deregulatory interests portray environmentalists' claims as non-science. Deregulatory demarcation includes tactics for producing scientific uncertainty about chemical harms and scientific certainty about chemical safety. Deregulatory demarcation often combines tactics of uncertainty and certainty. For example, insisting that regulatory decisions must be evidence-based, that is scientific, while at the same time claiming as valid only a narrow set of methodologies that cannot yield evidence that would support regulation. So in this way, calls for more science about chemical exposures have been as likely to narrow and occlude our knowledge about toxicity and harm as they are to ground strong claims for protections. In turn, environmental advocates often respond by seeking to defend science by making counterclaims about the boundary between science and not science. This is clearly the dominant impulse underpinning our reaction to the Trump administration. And pro-regulatory demarcation treats the production of uncertainty and doubt as anti-science denialism and doubles down on calls for evidence-based regulatory decision-making. The argument of books such as those on the screen, and that includes the the Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway, is that efforts to undermine regulatory science are not science at all, and to see them as such is to fall for denialist rhetoric. These authors argue that instead we should recognize that these are cynical political efforts that cloak themselves as science in order to undermine even well-established science. And I will say that these books are good reads if you're interested. But it's in the context of these debates about regulatory science that demarcation became the core of chemical risk analysis as practiced at EPA and other federal agencies. Foundational was this 1983 National Academies report, the Red Report, risk assessment in the federal government managing the process. The report acknowledged that all scientific knowledge production involves judgments, and it formalized the separation of science from policy in order to protect science from political meddling and thereby legitimize policy decisions. Its central recommendation was that regulatory agencies firmly demarcate scientific risk assessment, which is about the harms of chemicals, the doses at which those harms manifest, the exposures, and the integration of these in risk characterization. So to demarcate risk assessment so that it can inform subsequent and more openly political risk management, which is identifying, evaluating, choosing, implementing regulatory actions. Now, the National Academies reaffirmed this underlying demarcation in its 2009 report, Science and Decisions Advancing Risk Assessment. Citing these reports, EPA insists, and I quote, that risk assessment is to the highest extent possible a scientific process. So given the history of ongoing demarcation, it's precisely this claim to science that makes risk assessment such a rich target for deregulatory action. As decades of scholarship on controversy and regulatory science has shown, claiming the scientific high ground tends to inflame debate. As Jasanoff, again, she'll be my muse for the day, said regarding EPA debates in the 1980s, close attention to the scientific process did not resolve but increased uncertainty. She says public debate over legitimacy of science policy decisions intensified as both the production and analysis of scientific knowledge were increasingly drawn into public view. Across a range of environmental controversies, each side tries to show that their perspectives are scientific, while their opponents are normative and political, and they accuse the other side of being non-scientific for even raising the question of values in politics. So in other words, it's not just that risk assessment always requires judgment, as the National Academies acknowledged. The point is that demarcation between science and non-science is always a political process of boundary work that paradoxically must disavow its political nature and then is subject to becoming politicized during controversies. The lesson is that it is not despite, but precisely because formalized risk analysis since the 1980s has sought to separate science and policy, that it is now ripe for contestation over science. The key point is that when demarcation is the contested ground, engaging in demarcation will not resolve controversy. So instead of insisting that the Trump administration's obvious political motivations mean that their efforts are non-science, it's useful instead to reframe their efforts as deregulatory science. This ongoing history also sheds light on how the EPA engaged in deregulatory science, altering the process of risk analysis to produce both certainty to close debate on chemical safety and uncertainty to dismiss as scientifically unsound claims about chemical harms. So let me turn then to the Trump EPA's efforts to rewrite the rules of chemical risk analysis. In what follows, I'll provide examples regarding costs, hazards, and exposures. And across the examples, I show how the Trump EPA shifts the mode of risk analysis to make it unlikely to show actionable harm from chemical exposures, and how the Trump EPA defended those approaches as being more scientifically sound. So all the rules I'll discuss today were finalized by the Trump administration, some during that deregulatory spree in spring 2020, a year ago, some much more recently. Not all of them have gone into effect. And the Biden administration is walking back several of them back already. So I'll indicate their status as I go. So first, costs, or the process of making regulation of air pollution too expensive. In 2019, the Trump EPA released a new cost-benefit analysis of regulations imposing limits on emissions of mercury, which is a developmental neurotoxin, along with other hazardous air pollutants that are released by coal and oil-fired power plants. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, this new analysis conducted by the Trump EPA found that costs vastly exceed benefits, and hence the regulations known as the mercury and air toxic standards are unjustified. These mercury standards were put in place in 2011 during the Obama administration, and that itself was over 20 years after Congress directed EPA to control mercury emissions. So after they were put into place, a coalition of states, including Oklahoma with Scott Pruitt as Attorney General, sued the Obama administration to block the standards, claiming the EPA had not properly considered costs. So that again gives you a sense that these are longer term debates. In a 5-4 decision in 2015, the Supreme Court sided with these states, ruling that the scientific decision about whether the regulation is needed at all must include cost analysis. Two subsequent reanalyses by the Obama EPA still found the benefits of the regulation to outweigh the costs. But when Scott Pruitt took the helm at EPA in 2017, the agency reversed its approach, perhaps again, not surprisingly, arguing that the Obama EPA used invalid cost-benefit methodologies. So again, this is where we get into the science. The crux of the EPA argument is that the 2016 cost-benefit analysis improperly considered co-benefits. Now, this is policy wonk speak, so let me try to explain what this means. So they said that the Obama EPA analyses included benefits from reducing not only the mercury and the other things called hazardous air pollutants, which is a legal category, but also particulate matter and other criteria air pollutants, a different legal category. But coal and oil-fired power plants are major contributors of all of these. So the argument is that even if they come from the same source, criteria air pollutants and hazardous air pollutants are regulated under different sections of the Clean Air Act. Therefore, benefits of reducing one cannot be counted as benefits of reducing the other. The Trump EPA cost-benefit analysis therefore excluded co-benefits, thereby excluding the massive known benefits of reducing particulate matter, so that regulations to control mercury emissions from power plants no longer appear to be appropriate. While this in itself did not allow EPA to rescind the mercury standards, it did remake cost-benefit analysis as a deregulatory science. This approach and its findings are very controversial. For health advocates, the knock-on effects of a regulation are a strong argument in its favor. So the Union of Concerned Scientists called the arguments against co-benefits peak nonsense and defended them as efficiencies. Prominent economists argued in Science that the mercury standards benefits are underestimated, not overstated, and have come out strongly in support of including co-benefits in all forms of cost-benefit analysis, not just in this case. Indeed, EPA's own Science Advisory Board, which was led by and populated with Trump appointees, raised related criticisms when it reviewed the rule. But the final report of their final report was released in April 2020 during that fated spring, just days before the agency finalized the rule, making moot the advisory board's advice. So this rule was also promulgated during last spring in April. So this new approach to co-benefits, it was finalized in July, but they announced they were finalizing it in April. So this new approach to co-benefits was subsequently adopted in EPA's analysis for its 2019 Affordable and Clean Energy Rule. So again, they innovated this method during the MATS, or the mercury standards, and then applied it to the Affordable and Clean Energy Rule, which was finalized before the mercury rule, so timing's off. But so the Affordable and Clean Energy Rule repealed the Obama era Clean Power Plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then, so using the new calculations of costs, Affordable Clean Energy Rule dramatically loosened regulation of power plants and automobiles. And the Affordable Clean Energy Rule was struck down by the courts just in January, not on cost-benefit grounds, but on allowable emissions reduction measures. So the EPA now has the opportunity to actually strengthen the emissions of rules governing emissions of greenhouse gases. Also from early on, the Trump EPA signaled its intent to institutionalize these changes as standard practice. And towards this end, in December 23rd, the agency finalized a rule called Increasing Consistency and Transparency in Considering Benefits and Costs in the Clean Air Rulemaking Process. And this name itself, it calls on scientific principles, consistency and transparency. To date, this rule still stands. So let me turn now to the hazard analysis stage of formal risk assessment. So hazard analysis includes what's called hazard identification, which is the actual problems that a chemical causes, the adverse effects. And it also includes dose response assessment, and that's the exposure levels that would lead to those adverse effects. Exposure analysis is separate, which is about the exposures that people actually experience in the world. So the Trump EPA sought to direct hazard analysis agency-wide in its Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science rule, which the agency proposed in 2018. with the goal of what it called standardizing use of health studies and dose response models during risk assessment. This rule was finalized in the very last days of the Trump administration, actually in January, and it was vacated in the courts just a few weeks later on February 1st, so less than 2 months ago, at the request of the Biden administration. And it was vacated on the grounds of improper process, not substance. So, but I think it's important to think about what this rule was really doing. The rule was an effort to achieve through regulatory means some controversial measures that previously had failed legislatively. The 2018 proposed rule was in fact a lightning rod. It was covered extensively in the media, and the initial proposal received almost 600,000 formal public comments. Many prominent scientists and science organizations came out against the rule. There was a letter signed by 985 scientists, for example. And I was a lead author on one report submitted to the EPA as a comment, working with the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. And in the wake of this onslaught of criticism, late in 2019, EPA released a revised proposal. But instead of mollifying concerns, the agency dramatically expanded the rule's scope. Wheeler was actually more ambitious than Pruitt, so that it applies not just to dose response data and models, but to all data and models. The 2018 proposal would require EPA to exclude any study that does not make underlying data available for reanalysis, irrespective of the significance of the study's findings or how well regarded the study is. So this is about making data public. The final rule didn't entirely exclude these studies, but made them lower priority. While applying across the agency, the rule was a reaction to the influential role of several hallmark longitudinal epidemiological studies establishing harm to human health. One of these was about pesticide exposure, but the most controversial is a set of Harvard studies on particulate matter, focusing on particulate matter. And these have been a deregulatory target since the 1990s, when the first of these six cities studies established a link between particulate matter and mortality, showing the 1993 paper here on the top. The EPA used these studies, these Harvard studies, to establish regulatory standards. And as I just showed, these standards were not just directly related to particulate matter, but also to things like mercury. And indeed, the study last spring that first established a link between particulate matter and COVID was another of these Harvard studies, and that's what I'm showing here on the screen on the lower right. And it was dismissed by EPA when it decided not to strengthen the particulate matter regulations, the standards, even during the pandemic. In other words, this rule is part of a multi-decade effort to dismiss evidence of chemical harms, especially from particulate matter. Less remarked in public commentary, the rule also requires EPA to include a range of dose response models rather than assume a linear relationship. There on the upper left of this set of graphs. In a linear relationship, low dose exposures are considered to be less harmful than high doses. That might seem intuitive, but it's not necessarily how it works. So proponents of less regulation often argue that chemicals follow a threshold dose response relationship in which exposure is safe below some level. So that's shown on the upper right. In addition to linear and threshold models, the strengthening transparency rule explicitly embraced and promoted a controversial model called hormesis. And that's there on the lower left, which is the idea that low dose exposures may be healthful, kind of like an immunization, a vaccine. Got my shot yesterday. With the idea that it would kind of promote our body to have some kind of protective response to get it used to particulate matter, to get it used to other kinds of pollutants. And the idea is even that maybe small amounts of pollution would be good for children so that they could adapt to this dirty world. Note that health advocates also promote inclusion of a greater range of dose response models, but generally do so to account for chemicals that have greater negative effect at lower doses, which is the opposite of hormesis. So as the title of the rule itself declares, EPA cast this effort to narrow the evidence that it uses in risk analysis in terms of protecting scientific integrity. So it's strengthening transparency, right? Pruitt said about the rule, the era of secret science is coming to an end. Americans deserve to assess the legitimacy of the science underpinning EPA decisions that may impact their lives. A sentiment that I think most people would agree with. The very first paragraph of the rule's justification repeats these lofty ideals, saying that the best available science must serve as the foundation of EPA's regulatory actions. Enhancing the transparency and validity of the scientific information relied upon by EPA strengthens the integrity of EPA's regulatory actions and its obligation to ensure the agency is not arbitrary in its conclusions. EPA must ensure that its decision-making is marked by independence, objectivity, transparency, clarity, and reproducibility. The result, though, is a framework for hazard analysis that would lowball the benefits of regulation, both by removing studies that show harms and by including these dose response models that show not only less harm, but even health benefit from pollution. As with mercury standards, even the EPA Scientific Advisory Board was cautious, warning that the effects of these measures are likely to be massive, was the word they used. But EPA moved ahead anyway. In the name of science and evidence, the rule would make it much harder to demonstrate harms from chemical exposures. Okay, so that's costs and hazards. So finally, I'll turn to the exposure aspect of risk analysis. And to do so, I provide a bit more detail about how the Trump EPA implemented the 2016 Toxic Substances Control Act and about how their implementation narrowed exposure scenarios in a way that drastically narrowed the scope of risk analysis, narrowed what they would actually look at. So the 2016 update to TSCA, as it's known, passed with bipartisan support just months before Trump was elected. It was June or July of that year. It is significantly more precautionary than the original 1976 version. That version required evidence of harm before EPA could evaluate a chemical. Pretty absurd. The 2016 update mandates safety reviews for all chemicals to determine whether they present a, quote, an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. The problem, of course, is that there's about 100,000 chemicals that need to be evaluated. Each one takes several years. The TSCA told EPA to develop a process for not only doing the risk analysis, but for figuring out how to prioritize chemicals. And the law also named 10 high priority chemicals for EPA to evaluate immediately. These 10 here on the screen include the mineral asbestos and the 9 highly toxic petrochemicals, that means that they're derived from oil, coal, and or natural gas, that are used mainly as solvents, not only as solvents, but mainly. And as such also are some of the sources of particulate matter as volatile organic compounds. So in its framework documents, the Trump EPA affirms that EPA's overall objective is to ensure that it is able to focus on conducting a timely, relevant, high quality, and scientifically credible evaluation of a chemical substance as a whole. However, it then goes on to narrow what can be evaluated and how, in particular by defining what the conditions of use under which to evaluate risk. So conditions of use is a term that comes from the law, from TSCA, and these are the circumstances under which people might be exposed to a chemical, and is defined in TSCA as circumstances that are intended, known, or reasonably foreseen to be manufactured, processed, distributed in commerce, used, or disposed of. So note that this is covering chemicals in use, maybe in their disposal, but it's not specifically about pollution. So decisions about conditions of use profoundly affect overall risk characterization. How do we know what the risks are? By determining which exposures will be considered during the actual evaluation, and hence which will not be included, even if they exist. So first, EPA's framework provides a narrow definition of conditions of use generally. The agency first affirmed a legislative intent to broaden analysis. So it said the EPA believes the addition of the phrase conditions of use was intended to move the agency away from its past practice of assessing only narrow uses of a chemical substance toward a more inclusive approach to chemical substance management. Indeed, that is what the law suggested. Yet the very next paragraph of this rule goes on to say, however, this does not mean that EPA will necessarily consider every activity involving the chemical substance, because the administrator may determine that certain uses fall outside the definition of conditions of use. In short, EPA uses expansive language of both scientific integrity and legislative intent to say that it will evaluate the scientific weight of evidence regarding all conditions of use, and gives itself discretion to decide that conditions of use do not include all uses. Second, given this discretion, EPA provides extensive discussion of exclusions from the definition of conditions of use. At stake here is the second half of the formal definition regarding what counts as manufactured, processed, distributed in commerce, used, or disposed of, and emphasizing that decisions about conditions of use should be evidence-based, not anecdotal. EPA claims that TSCA is ambiguous on whether conditions of use include what it calls legacy uses and disposals, which are those that do not reflect ongoing or prospective manufacturing, processing, or distribution. These are the circumstances in which the chemical is in the environment already. In light of this ambiguity, the Trump decided that conditions of use does not include legacy uses or disposals. It said EPA interprets the mandates to focus on uses for which manufacturing, processing, or distribution in commerce is intended, known to be occurring, or reasonably foreseen to occur. And it interprets the definition of conditions of use in that context. So they provide as an example that they would include in an evaluation of a chemical substance used in insulation today or in the future, but would not include the same chemical in previously installed insulation. For example, past uses of asbestos are outside the bounds of conditions of use, despite asbestos being a widely used chemical that is a well-known carcinogen. In short, when prioritizing chemicals for risk analysis, EPA will evaluate all conditions of use for a chemical substance as required by TSCA, but gives itself discretion to define conditions of use to only include uses now and in the future. Third, as though that's not good enough, during planning, EPA may decide to narrow the scope of the risk evaluation further, potentially excluding conditions of use. As before, EPA says that this decision is not just a factual determination, but will inevitably involve the exercise of some discretion to make reasonable, technically sound scoping decisions. EPA emphasizes that the agency will not base this determination upon hypotheticals or conjecture. It says that reasonably foreseen conditions of use are fact-specific. The principle is that EPA should try to minimize speculation when identifying reasonably foreseen conditions of use. Couched as a defense of evidence-based decision-making, at stake here is whether unintended uses of a chemical can be reasonably foreseen and so evaluated or not. Indeed, the Trump EPA treated unintended circumstances not as foreseen, but as mere conjecture. For example, EPA states that all conditions of use include intended risk mitigation practices, such as engineering controls and personal protective equipment. Any use of the chemical without such equipment, whether accidental or purposeful, is not intended, so is not reasonably foreseen, and so is not a condition of use. And this is borne out in recent risk evaluations for those 10 chemicals which have been completed. For example, in its risk evaluation of the solvent 1-bromopropane, EPA found no unreasonable risk for most conditions of use because they assumed that workers were always using both respirators and gloves. Exposures without these protections was unintended and so was not evaluated. In short, the Trump EPA acknowledges that the updated TSCA newly required broad evaluations of all chemicals. But in writing the framework for TSCA risk evaluation, EPA excluded evaluation of accidents. It excluded evaluation of lack of safety precautions, the very circumstances that one might be most concerned about. By insisting that conditions of use be evidence-based, EPA demarcates its approach as the scientific one, even as it uses the approach to narrow evaluation and justify weak regulation. And this is just one set of ways EPA limited evaluation of chemicals, both old and new. So I've always thought that the average person hearing that the EPA has made an affirmative safety determination for a chemical would likely find all this quite surprising. So of course, EPA's assertions don't make it so. A coalition of environmental, health, and labor organizations sued EPA over its implementation of TSCA. In 2019, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals used EPA's own words to rule that the EPA cannot exclude conditions of use. That EPA's claims about its legal discretion and scientific integrity are not only hotly contested by advocates of health and environment, but also are questioned in the legal arena is not an exception forged during the Trump era, but is quite predictable given decades of contestation about EPA knowledge production as a deregulatory science apparatus. Okay, so this range of examples demonstrates that the Trump EPA sought to recreate frameworks of risk analysis in the mode of deregulatory science. These frameworks compel the agency to ignore significant pathways of exposure, to eliminate pivotal studies of hazards, to include dose response models that treat pollution as healthful, to change what costs and benefits can be included in regulatory analyses. The Trump EPA justified these frameworks in terms of scientific integrity, evidence-based decision-making, transparency, the separation of science from politics. In other words, EPA justified these frameworks by engaging in demarcation, claiming that its approaches reject conjecture and are more scientific than the methods of risk analysis that show a need for regulation. So this demonstrates clear continuity with debates in regulatory science throughout the history of EPA. It is not the case that anti-regulatory arguments used to be pro-science and became anti-science more recently, nor is it that the Trump EPA simply made up claims to justify deregulation. Instead, throughout this time, anti-regulatory interests have developed deregulatory scientific approaches, and these have been adopted by EPA to greater and lesser extent under different presidential administrations, and no administration has rejected them entirely, and I'd be happy to say more about that in the Q&A. This is not to say that there was nothing new with the Trump EPA. This was certainly a new chapter in an ongoing story, and it deepens our understanding of mechanisms by which deregulation is embraced and justified. One key lesson is that arguments about specific claims, for example, arguments about whether use of chemicals without protective gear can be reasonably foreseen, these become arguments about science itself. So depending on science to justify regulation presents a paradox. Once science is the backstop to regulation, then debates about regulation become debates about science. This makes regulatory decision-making more technical, more opaque. It undermines participation and democratization. And more to the point, it leads not to closure and consensus, but actually to greater uncertainty. Contesting deregulation by defending science opens the door for deregulatory approaches to lean into scientific values, which is exactly what the Trump EPA did, claiming its approach is even more scientifically sound than the alternatives. Scientific integrity, objectivity, transparency, evidence, open-mindedness about dose response models are the grounds on which Trump's EPA made its deregulatory claims. Defining and defending scientific principles is just as much a strategy of deregulation as it is of regulation. So to conclude, as should be clear, the point of calling EPA's strategy deregulatory science is not to legitimize its approaches. Indeed, the sentiment that I would be legitimating the Trump EPA's approaches by calling them science, to me demonstrates the impasse that's created by efforts to defend science through demarcation. It suggests that all scientific knowledge is by definition legitimate, and that the only allowable grounds for questioning scientific claims are themselves scientific. The point instead is to highlight the relationship between science, knowledge, and power. Scholars in multiple fields, political ecology, geographers, central among them, have spent the past half-century challenging the idea that scientific experts should always be trusted, precisely because claims to scientific authority in many cases have been pernicious. They've underpinned exploitation and harm, not care and protection. In recent years, there's been some concern that these ideas contribute to an anti-science ethos that animates debates over things like climate change and chemical harms. However, as others also argue, accepting these strong claims need not be a path to post-truth relativism and the death of evidence. Rather, understanding how knowledge is mobilized against environmental protections requires attending to the values, judgments, and politics that underpin regulatory science and its high-stakes decision-making, not to dismiss them for having politics, this is inevitable, but to understand what those politics are and how they matter. Values and politics shape, for example, what counts as harm, safety, and good evidence, whether it's more important to avoid false positives, that's finding harm when there is none, or false negatives, not finding harms that actually exist. Values and power shape what counts as authoritative knowledge at all. And these are questions about science that have no purely scientific answer. And to bring this full circle to my introduction, values and power shape what sorts of racist and classist injustices are institutionalized further in our regulatory policy and knowledge. Again, my point is not just that the deregulatory approaches of the Trump EPA exacerbated air pollution in ways that disproportionately harm poorer, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, though that is certainly a key point. The larger point is that contestation over knowledge about those harms, the racially unjust harms of fossil fuels and petrochemicals, drove the Trump EPA's deregulatory science. The Trump EPA's embrace of deregulatory risk analysis shows how important it is to make explicit the power relations of the science of environmental health and harm. The question is not whether politics shape science, but which politics and values shape science. That is where I will end.
Hi, Becky. I think
Hi,
I'm
Max.
supposed to, hey, I think I'm supposed to jump in here. First off, thank you so much. There's a lot of clapping that you maybe can't hear. Thanks I knew it would be an excellent talk and you did not disappoint. It's super interesting. We wanted to take this chance to, well, first to say thanks and then also to open it up for questions. So I think following a tradition that we've instituted roughly a year ago, so it's a new tradition, we're trying to get grad students or undergrads listening to offer the first question and to really be proactive in jumping in with questions. And so we'll try to open up this Q&A that way. And I'll try to keep an eye here on the Q&A box to anticipate questions being raised by grad students. And if that is you, well, I guess I'd recognize if it's a grad student or not. So no need to put some special code or anything. Yeah. But sure enough, this was a longer version of the talk you gave at Dope. So it's great to hear how it's evolved.
Yeah, and to think more about the continuity, I think is one of the things that's been really important for me in kind of rethinking and kind of trying to grapple with what was going on with the Trump administration, where on the one hand, I would say to myself, well, isn't this just an example of like the kind of stuff political ecologists have been doing for years? Like we've been saying that, state knowledge can be, in the name of science, can be terrible. And then I say, but we're supposed to be defending science right now. So what does that look like? And so I think, the lessons here are broader ones, like about how to, react in our era of climate science denial, and, how do we think about those? It's not just about the Trump administration, but to think about these long-term efforts to, not think about our environmental harms, or to treat them as, as non-existent. And there's been this strong effort among scientists, I think, and among, those books that I mentioned, policymakers, to say, what we need to do is to defend science. And if we call those things science, then we're falling into a trap. And I actually kind of think it's the opposite. To not recognize them as science is to fall into their own trap, or its own trap. Let me just get into like a sniping I have science. No, you have science. No, I have science. No, I have science. But I think what really matters is what kind of questions we're asking and how.
Yeah, it's one of the things I find that's interesting is it requires a certain higher order, or at least a kind of displacement of the usual frameworks that we've come so accustomed to thinking about when it comes to, like, this is good science, this is bad science, or this is correct science, wrong science, or this is science and this is not science. But really, I guess training people, I guess you would say, or making people, informed enough to understand and differentiate between science that is, or the ways in which science operates, right? So I guess it's really
Yeah.
a much more sophisticated grasp of how science works as a social body of knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the challenges, is that it requires people to be able to think about, like, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about what's good and bad science, because that's part of the whole point, right? But it's also not to think about it as being good and bad necessarily in the abstract, but good and bad for what? Because one of the things as you start delving into these controversies about, like, do these chemicals cause harm or not, is the ways in which a study might show that it doesn't cause harms, but then somebody else can say, well, that's because it was constructed in such a way that it couldn't show those harms, and then somebody says, well, that study was designed to show harms. It's like, well, that study was actually designed to show harms if they exist, right? And so I think that that being able to adjudicate that does take some scientific literacy. But I actually think that the opposite does also, and that's kind of another part of the argument that I didn't really develop here so much, which is that as you start making these claims about needing to separate science and politics. So say in risk analysis, you say, well, there's that separation between risk management and risk analysis, or the risk assessment itself. And so then you say, well, behind the risk assessment, there should be some decision making. And so then you have an analysis that comes before that. And you saw this with Tosca, where they'd have this prioritization process. And that was a scientific analysis in itself. And then behind the prioritization process was a pre-prioritization process, which had a scientific analysis in itself. So you could, and behind that is something else and something else. So there's this kind of infinite regress of looking for the space of pure science, which becomes incredibly technical, to the point where there might be literally 3 people who are in the world who are able to follow and parse what's going on in those debates. And so that's part of why it's like, yes, there might require some scientific literacy, but I actually think that it's easier for people to understand this study was designed to find, this study was designed in such a way that's more worried about not finding harms than about finding them. Whereas this study was more, was set up to be more worried about acting on things that aren't, that maybe turn out to be not so bad. And you can actually I think people can understand some of those differences. This study was designed with environmental health in mind. This study wasn't, right? And I think that those are easier to understand than the kind of arcane technical details of a pre-prioritization process.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to command too much time here, but I'm looking.
Well, I'm not seeing anybody writing in the question and answer. Yes, I understand that a recording will be available later for the one question that came up. So one
of the things, well, as maybe I just want to reiterate that people should jump in, because if not, I will keep asking Becky questions, because I find this stuff fascinating. I think at the DOPE conference I asked too many questions. It was kind of annoying, but I don't mean to be. So despite myself, but there is an element that I found interesting too, though. With the last administration, that well, there's a question now, but I'll just say it, and maybe you can say something about it later if you want or whatever. But just that there's correct me, maybe it was my perception, and maybe that's just because of where I stood, but there was a sense of a certain amount of gaslighting, as well as kind of like Scott Pruitt had an eternal smirk on his face, like he kind of knew. And again, you don't want to like read into the face, and that's like that's not helpful. But there's a certain quality to it that I thought was really interesting at the time, right? And made it sort of added a kind of twist to the knife, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me answer that, but I'd also, people, if you want to ask a question, you can type a question. You can type a question into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll see either one. I don't own the Zoom, so I can't, I would love to have people speak up. If somebody can make that happen, I'd rather talk to people than just answer typed questions, but feel free to type your questions.
Yeah, someone just asked here. Well, Madhu just asked in the chat if she can type or speak, and of course, yeah, she can speak. That's great. I don't know. I'm not in control.
Somebody has to give her permission to speak. So Kendra says, does evidence-based policy hold any meaning anymore? Well, that's part of the question, right? I mean, so to me, what the ways in which evidence-based policy, or this idea of evidence, this idea of science, this idea of scientific integrity gets thrown around as a way to gain legitimacy. And you read these statements by by Trump administration appointees, and they sound great, and I would read them. I had to figure out how to phrase these things to make it clear that I wasn't, when I would read, when I would kind of write about or read somebody something about what the Trump administration was doing, they say, well, that sounds good. And I would be like, exactly, that's the point, is that it sounds good because they're using this language. So I think, while some of us might be like, we roll our eyes, evidence-based policy, yeah, sure, it doesn't mean anything. Can mean, or means everything, or people can make it mean whatever the hell they want, kind of like what Max is saying with gaslighting. I think that it does still have power. And I think that was part of what I found so interesting about kind of looking at these justifications and over and over again in yes, the smirky, signing ceremonies and all this that that was this way of gaining legitimacy. So Kendra says again, it sounds rhetorical. That's the point, is that it sounds rhetorical, but it actually is about how things are being done. So I'm kind of pushing back on the idea that it's just rhetorical. And that there actually is about how people are going about producing knowledge, and that we, that we can dismiss something as rhetorical, but the power is still there. So that was of it. So, and then she says, I guess what I mean is there seems to be an appetite for emotion-based policy, for example. Yeah, maybe there is. Maybe that's part of a shift. That certainly wasn't how the EPA framed its approaches. And maybe that is because science and basing policy on best available science, weight of evidence, is written into these laws, into these environmental laws, and which again goes back to the question of demarcation, right? So it's written into the laws as this way of saying we're going to be based on science, not emotion, and that goes back to that kind of division between accusing environmentalists as being emotional and romantic and anti-science, and so we're going to do this based on science. So I think it goes back to some of that. I haven't heard the term emotion-based policy, so maybe I'm missing something. But I think, so the fact that science is written in, it might be part of it. Thanks, Kendra, she made it up. Maybe, but maybe that's what I'm arguing for, but it's not emotions, it's about values. It's about what in fact do we want to know, and how are we going to go about knowing it? I see there's a question from Matt. When I look back on the past decade, I see a sort of dethronement of specialized knowledges of all sorts. Well, maybe not dethronement, maybe a hyper-tacticalization of knowledge. Okay, that's a lame phrase. But what I mean is that bits and pieces of an otherwise scholarly endeavor are extracted and taken out of context, twisted and turned, made to say things that weren't originally intended, put to use in all sorts of weird and damaging ways. Is that deregulatory science? I guess it depends on the context. Absolutely, it seems like everything is taken out of context and, you know, kind of spliced and put together in ways unintended. I'm not sure that's just in scholarly work. I'd have to think about the context of that. This is where I wish we were speaking to each other and that I wasn't just talking to a camera sitting in my office. Matt, do you have an example? Can somebody unmute Matt so he can give me an example?
I don't know how to unmute anyone. I don't think I have that power. I don't even see the questions you're seeing, Becky.
Oh, you don't see him in the chat?
No.
Oh, you don't see the Q&A? All right.
Hold on. Oh, never mind.
Harvey's got a hand up, I think.
Okay. He should go ahead and ask.
Oh, here he is. I've been looking on the literature on post-normal science, which argues for crucial societal challenges such as climate change and sustainability. Scientists should explicitly recognize uncertainty and value neutrality and instead embrace these. Instead of making predictions, scientists should tell stories that mix quant-qual evidence that describes possible futures, their value trade-offs, and their degree of confidence in that knowledge. Just wondering about your reaction. I mean, overall, yes, I think post-normal science still tries to kind of hang on to kind of, you know, a level of kind of positivist value neutrality, but argue that other things should be worked in also. But I think overall that kind of sense that not just recognizing uncertainty, but not just recognizing it, but embracing it, as you say. And it's not just quant qual, but it's about thinking about not just value trade-offs. So I guess I'm saying something a little bit different in that it's not just about like thinking about the implications of things, the implications of our knowledge, but recognizing how the politics of what counts as knowledge and what we want to know things about get worked into the knowledge itself, into the science itself. So I think that that's part of the distinction. I think post-normal science is a part of this kind of expansion. I'm not saying anything that people in science studies haven't said, but it's more thinking through what it means in the kind of broader context of the last 4 years and or more, and the kind of shift, the kind of questions about, you know, well, are we falling into some kind of post-truth relativism? Are we, you know, do we have the end of evidence? And I think some of the kind of work in science studies, work in post-normal science, work in a kind of a variety of ways is trying to actually provide an alternative to either we have science or we have, you know, or we have the lack of evidence. So kind of thinking in more complicated ways about what evidence is. So post-normal science part of a movement that I think is important, but maybe not far enough. Rand Paul, Dr. Fauci in the Senate the other day, Paul plucking selected bits and pieces of a study, essentially misrepresenting the findings. Yeah, I mean, right, but getting away from the dualism of representation and misrepresentation. I mean, this is the hard bit because in many ways it's like, yeah, there's a lot of misrepresentation and there's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of, you know, rhetoric. There's a lot of lying. I think that those things exist. You know, I don't think like there's a lot of Shell Oil or Monsanto knowing about the, you know, negative effects of glyphosate or DuPont or Dow Chemical. They know about these things and don't talk about them and hide them. So those things exist and the kind of misrepresentations exist. And I don't want to say that they don't, but I think that the challenge is how to respond to that without getting into nitpicking about whether it's science or not. I think that's actually unhelpful. I think instead is to say, what is your purpose for plucking these selected bits and pieces of this study? And, you know, how is that actually not about the study itself, but is about the kind of, you know, politics that you're advancing. And I think the same thing for Fauci. But so it's not to say that Rand Paul has politics and Fauci doesn't, but then to say the same thing about Fauci. Why are you what is it? What are the values and politics that you're advancing that make you make the knowledge claims that you do, and how is evidence a part of that? So I guess it's more the getting away from saying one side has politics and the other doesn't, but to thinking about how those politics are there all the time. And that doesn't mean that there are no such thing as a lie or no such thing as evidence suppression, but just that there's no such thing as a knowledge claim without politics. And that every time we try to dismiss somebody else's claims because they have politics, we're falling into a trap. And we're actually letting ourselves off the hook of articulating what our own politics and values are that are animating our own knowledge claims, and debating those values and politics, addressing the power relations of those knowledge and politics and values, instead of just falling back on a kind of, a rejecting politics as making something be non-knowledge, non-science. Another question from UA. And here's a question from a student, Laurel, then I'll come back to UA's. How did we come to see science as a force advocating rather than restricting regulations so that we normally see the Trump EPA as anti-scientific? Is this primarily because of pressing climate science in the past decades? I think that this is actually a really interesting question, Laurel. And I do think that the question about climate science is obviously, a huge part of this, is the ways in which there have been attacks on climate science. I think that there's also been so attacks on climate science and the kind of desire to defend that science, which again I completely understand, have been animating forces. But I actually think that there has been a kind of a broader shift in kind of technocratic progressivism, shall I say, in the neoliberal era, to try to appear reasonable and capitalist, to try to not shake the boat, whatever that phrase is, right? To not upset the boat, to not shake things up, to kind of work within the system. And I think the kind of embrace of science has been a part of that. Like, see, we're reasonable people. We believe in science. And so I think that that's been a part of the kind of politics of the neoliberal era, when environmentalism became neoliberal in the 1980s with sustainable development, and really kind of leaving off its more radical criticisms. And so I think that's a part of when kind of environmentalism embraced science as the way to achieve its goals. As I pointed out earlier, there's plenty of evidence that shows that scientific perspectives and scientific knowledge underpinned environmentalist claims from the beginning. Certainly Rachel Carson, right? Rachel Carson was based on scientific perspectives, and her science, as a woman in the 1960s was challenged extensively, right? But those claims, so there's claims about what is science and not science go back to that. So I think that there have been some big shifts in environmentalism in the 1980s and 90s that do that. Ariel asks, so did the EPA emerge to do deregulatory science in response to the environmental movement, trying to justify itself as more scientific to do regulatory work, or is that the shift from Nixon to Reagan? Yeah, so I think that the EPA was a more complicated beast in the 1970s. It didn't know what the hell it was, right? So it was created in 1970 by Richard Nixon, who then went on to attack it, as well as his other environmental regulations, or environmental laws that were promulgated under his watch in the early 1970s. And there was I don't think that the EPA emerged to do deregulatory science, because I don't think it knew what it was going to be doing. I think, and so those were the claims, that it was actually being too regulatory, and doing its science was not science, was too regulatory and therefore not scientific enough. That is what you got that shift in the 1980s. So I think there was more of a zeal in the very earliest days of the EPA, but of course it didn't have teeth and it didn't have legs, didn't know what it was doing as much, and the laws weren't as formed. And it was these kind of debates about what it was doing that led to that 1980s call for more science, on the part of the during the Reagan administration. Let's see, I probably didn't fully answer that question. Let me go back up to Yue's question. The roles of the Scientific Advisory Board. Many scientists left it during Trump's administration, partly because they do not want to endorse Trump's EPA. Would like to hear your comments on this. Also wondering, are there better ways at all for scientists to affect policy making during Trump's administration or similar Trumps? Hopefully not. Indeed, we don't know. I'm not quite ready to say we're not in the Trump era anymore. Yeah, the role of the Scientific Advisory Board and the various other advisory panels is something that's not in this paper that I've written, but is part of something I've been thinking about for a kind of another paper, because it is quite fascinating. So on the one hand, one of the ways that this deregulatory science got installed was through the Trump, the administrators, first Pruitt and Wheeler, really remaking their advisory board. So they actually disbanded some, like the Economic Board, and the Particulate Matter Board and the Ozone Board. These were all some scientific committees that got disbanded, and they stacked the ones that remained, like the Science Advisory Board, with many of their own choices that were industry-led lobbyists, and in fact have been some of the people who've been involved in this deregulatory science push from since the 1980s and 90s in some cases. And people not only left, but were kicked off. So Robin Wilson, who gave a talk earlier in our own colloquium series, she's a professor here at OSU, was one of the people who was kicked off the Science Advisory Board, and didn't want to be kicked off. So the question, and yet that Scientific Advisory Board was surprisingly, very surprisingly, challenged some of these rules, including the mercury and air, the mercury standards, cost benefit decision, and the strengthening transparency and regulatory science, and even then got steamrolled by the EPA's administrators. So the Scientific Advisory Boards, that's really what Sheila Jasanoff was writing about, was one of the ways that in the 1980s, that this is when these Scientific Advisory Boards got set up as a way to justify and legitimate the EPA's decision making, to say, well, if it's vetted by scientists, then we'll know that it's good. We'll know that it's really good science and that it's not politically tainted. And of course, that's another example about how that demarcation doesn't really work, because the decision about who to put on the advisory board or who counts as a scientist is very much is still a political decision, and it's still a judgment. There are also the National Academy's reports is another way that there's been an effort to have science, external, outside, non-EPA scientists involved in evaluating EPA science done by EPA scientists within the context of this kind of regulatory science, as well as the risk analysis process. So that was another part of the demarcation strategy, was to get the national academies involved. So all of this is to say that absolutely scientists should be involved. But I think that scientists also need to be clear about not just what makes, in their minds, good science, but what are the values that they are working from. And I say this I think we all do this, scientists, not scientists. I think about the climate scientists in our department who I know, and they do their work out of care, right? You want a climate scientist who's going to study climate because they care about what the environmental outcomes are going to be, right? You want people to be doing the work because they want to know what is going to be happening to our world, right? And so you want somebody studying the effects of a chemical who really wants to know what the effects of that chemical are, not somebody who kind of like would really rather not know, who has other interests at heart, who's really interested in protecting, some profits. So I don't think that this is contentious. I think it's a way of kind of providing scientists ways of thinking about their own work, and ways for all of us who don't do natural science work to think about that work in ways that could be more productive than the kind of defensive science, which then leaves open this space for, this kind of rhetoric. I'll use the word rhetoric. Anybody else? Maybe there's more down there. Are we at the end?
We're closing in on the end of time, but we do have time for 5 more minutes for one more. We don't want to take up any more of your time than necessary. Madhu, can you send the question again?
Madhu, I see Madhu does have a question here.
Okay.
It kind of got tucked down below. So it sounds like these agencies, EPA, science standards, evidences, are all very elastic. They expand, contract, take shape in different political moments. How do we think theoretically about this elasticity of science and regulatory agencies? Also, when we say Trump's EPA, it sounds like the agency speaks in voice, but perhaps there are other voices, actors. Maybe we'll hear those more under Biden's EPA. Absolutely, and I think that that's been one of the kind of interesting things about I mean, even to say Trump's EPA. I mean, as I've said, even Trump's scientific advisory board didn't speak with a single voice, right? And was able to push back. The kind of long-term permanent staff of the EPA, many people left because they were demoralized or because they were kind of pushed out, but many stayed, and some hunkered down, but some did some kind of fascinating pushback, both activist and not. So I attended an online webinar. It would have been last May. So in the midst of this breathing crisis, in the midst of the pandemic, right before the Black Lives Matter kind of emerged re-energized, but during while there were these debates about particulate matter and COVID, and what was EPA going to do about it, and EPA scientists who themselves do research on particulate matter held a webinar on the effects of their new science showing new kinds of effects of particulate matter on health that hadn't been known before, both on neurological health and also on some of the racial disparities. And so here and they held this webinar. It was like the most bizarre thing to watch, because on the one hand they were talking about these really important findings, and kind of going on without a single mention of the fact that this was like a political hot potato in the midst of the current EPA politics, COVID politics, particulate matter politics. They just kind of presented this as flat science, which I was kind of just flabbergasted, and I understood why they did it. I was still flabbergasted because it just seemed so like doing it was the politics of doing it, but like the idea that that they had to do that, and that they couldn't just say, here we as EPA scientists have something to say about these debates right now, and they couldn't do that. They just had to put it out there, which was an amazing statement for them to make. I super appreciated it. So yes, elastic. Shall we stop there in this bizarre format where I can't see anybody and don't know what anybody's thinking and saying?
I'm pretty sure I speak for everyone, just thinking that it was pretty awesome.
Well,
Um,
thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your attention. I hope to have a chance to talk in person at some point in the near future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Becky, for taking the time and sharing this with us. It's really great.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
Okay,
Bye.
everyone, take care. Bye.